Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out in this dreary weather. Thanks a million to Mary for the invitation and to Fiona for this wonderful room. I'm sorry about people standing at the back, but if you want to sit down, I won't be insulted, or so please make yourself as comfortable as possible. Some of you, not many of you, I think, are maybe old enough to remember Seinfeld. Anybody remember Seinfeld? The kind of groundbreaking sitcom about nothing. But there was an episode which was all about sort of arguing over who invented the brush-off line. It's not you, it's me. And watching the extraordinary implosion of not just British politics, but perhaps of the British polity last night, I think we have to remind ourselves it's not you, it's me. It's not the European Union, it's Britain. The strangest, most paradoxical thing about Brexit, perhaps, is that the last thing it's about is the EU. It's not even, perhaps, fundamentally about Britain's relationship to the European Union. It's much more about Britain's relationship to itself. And the fundamental unfinished business of belonging and identity within the United Kingdom, and particularly within England. I think we have to understand Brexit largely as being driven by the rise of an English national consciousness. And in itself, there's nothing at all historically unusual about this, and there's nothing innately reprehensible about it. England is as much entitled to its sense of national identity as anybody else is. The problem with it is that it's a poorly expressed and rather inarticulate nationalism. It dare not speak its own name, and therefore it has resulted in an upheaval which is itself inarticulate and really unclear about what it wants of itself. It's very striking in the last 12 to 24 hours that the response of the European Union to all of this has been to come back and just keep saying, tell us what you want. But in order to tell somebody what you want, you have to know what you want. And in order to know what you want, you have to kind of know who you are. So I just wanted to talk for the next 3 hours or so about some of the fundamentals of the collective psychology of Brexit, as it were. I never imagined myself going into a process of trying to psychoanalyze a nation, but I probably end up trying to do that a little bit. I hadn't really intended to write a book about Brexit at all because it's not really capable of being written yet. You usually want to know what the story is. Nobody knows what the story is. Nobody knows what the story is as it's been unfolding, so journalistically it's one of the strangest stories I've ever covered. Usually as a journalist, you always think, maybe it's the delusion of journalists, but you always think somebody knows what's really going on, and that if only you could find that person, you would really understand it. And it actually took quite a while with Brexit to realize, no, nobody knows. So in that sense, it's not really a great thing to write a book about. But also in just another sense that obviously our historic notion of what a phenomenon is very much shaped retrospectively by where it ends up, and we still have no fundamental idea as to what that might be. But I thought there was a different kind of book to be written, or a different kind of thing to explore, and it really, I was down in the Burren, supposed to be on holidays, and Boris Johnson resigned from the British cabinet, as he was always going to do once the vague prospect of taking responsibility for anything might even hove onto the horizon. And in his resignation letter to Theresa May, he said, the Brexit dream is dying. And it just, kind of one of those moments I started thinking, what's the dream? What's the dream world of Brexit? What's its unconscious, as it were? And so what I kind of started writing was an attempt really to just explore that unconscious. I recently came across, just a couple of weeks ago, I hadn't seen it before, I wish I had, a poem written by the very distinguished Scottish poet Douglas Dunn. And it was written in 1969, so even before Ireland and Britain joined the European Union. And it's called A Poem in Praise of the British. It's quite a long poem, but I just like to quote a little bit of it. He says, "Where did all that power come from? The wish to be inert, but rich and strong, to have too much. Where does glory come from? And when it's gone, why are old soldiers sour and banks empty? But how sweet is the weakness after empire in the garden of a flat, safe country shire." Then a different part of the poem, he says, "The archivist wears a sword and clipped moustache. He files our memories more precious than light, to be of easy access to politicians of the right, who now are sleeping like undertakers on black cushions, thinking of inflammatory speeches and the adoring mob." So obviously what Dunn was trying to get at, this is really only a quarter of a century after the end of the Second World War, and I suppose just right in the aftermath of the breakup of the empire, you know. What memories are being filed in this archive that will in future be of use to inflammatory politicians of the right? And what I want to suggest really is that Brexit really can't be understood unless we think about it in relation not to British history so much, but to a particular British idea of history, an idea of how history unfolds. And so Brexit is driven partly by sort of, you know, filed away half memories of the Second World War and empire, but framed in a way which also sort of tries to engage with the idea of history itself. And the fundamental problem of Brexit is the problem of Ireland, of course. Ireland is not so much the backstop as the doorstep on which Brexit stumbles on its way out. It can't leave. So in one of the early chapters of Ulysses, James Joyce's great novel, his alter ego, Stephen Dedalus, goes to collect wages that he's due. He's been doing some part-time teaching. And the opinionated headmaster, Mr. Deasy, talks at him a lot. And one of the things he talks at him about is history. He keeps talking about history. "History," Stephen replies, "is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." And then, you know, this is done from Stephen's perspective in his mind. "From the playfield, the boys raised a shout, a whirring whistle, goal. What if the nightmare give you a back kick?" So the great difficulty of Brexit, as we know here, was always going to be Ireland. It's the return of the repressed. They didn't talk about it, they didn't articulate it, they didn't deal with it, they had no plan for it. And now they're surprised that it's become a problem. But it's not just because of the obvious things, the enormous practical problems of dealing with the border, which we know about, and I'm not going to go into here. It's not even to do with the fact that the border itself is, as we also know very well from our own history, an impossible border. The impossibility is obvious from just the two numbers. 137, which is the entire number of border crossings on the entire eastern flank of the European Union. 208, which is the number of official border crossings between the north and south in Ireland. The Irish Army did a survey just before Christmas, and they found about 310. I suspect the number is actually infinite. It was Mandelbrot, the great mathematician who invented kind of fractal geometry. One of the questions that he asked to try to explain fractal geometry, thanks be to God, somebody tried to put it in terms that people like me could understand, but he asked the question, how long is the coast of Britain? And of course he pointed out that the more you measure it, the longer it gets. I mean, the better your measurement is, you go into every nook and cranny. And the Irish border is exactly like that, of course. The more you look at it, the bigger it gets, the more crossings there are, the more porous it becomes. So we know all that. So we know very much about the practicality of it and the way in which it was always going to be impossible to configure it as an international frontier, which in a sense it's never been. Of course, there are different jurisdictions on the islands, but it's never been anything like a border between a bloc of 27 countries and an outside country. So all of that was always going to be problematic. But what I want to really talk about is the deeper question that separates Ireland from Britain and where we are. And it's the question that Stephen Dedalus raises about the nightmare of history, and history being a nightmare from which you're trying to awake. What we're looking at really in the crux that Brexit has come to is two utterly incompatible ways of trying to escape history. We all in some ways desire to escape history, to imagine a future which is untrammeled by the uncertainties we've inherited from the past. Stephen Dedalus's expression of this desire raises two questions, one implicit, the other explicit. Firstly, what do you awake from the nightmare into? Secondly, what if the nightmare of history kicks back, as is in the text? Do you awake to reality, or do you merely escape into a kind of dream time? And if so, with what consequences? The deeper problem raised is not just that Ireland and the border are the great spoke in the Brexit wheel, it's that there is another kind of border, a line separating one way of thinking about the trajectory of history from another very different one. In Ireland, we've been trying to awake from the nightmare of history, but we've been trying to awake from the epic into the ordinary, from the gloriously simple into the fluidly complex, from the once and for all moment of national destiny into the openness and contingency of actual experience, with all its uncertainties and contradictions. In the England of Brexit, on the other hand, the process is working in reverse. The imagined movement has been from the ordinary into the epic, from the complex to the gloriously simple, from the openness and contingency of real life into the once and for all moment of national destiny. The 23rd of June 2016 as Independence Day, in Nigel Farage's terms, a day from which a new history begins, a day you can never turn back from. Now, this is a thing that emerging nationalisms do. We know all about this, of course, ourselves. Since recent history is always full of compromises, complexities, and contradictions, emerging nationalisms seek out the past, a past rather, that is not history, but in fact myth. Irish nationalism did this for well over a century. For English nationalism's June 2016, we can read Irish nationalism's Easter 1916. But the point is that Irish nationalism was eventually forced by suffering to return from the land of myth to compromises, complexities, and contradictions. The question for England now, and it's the question at the heart of the Brexit crisis, is how much suffering do you want to endure before you make the same journey that we've made in Ireland, from pursuing epic dreams to making peace with complex realities? So the problem of Brexit is, to borrow from T.S. Eliot, that history is now and England. But this promise turns out to be false. The moment of the referendum in 2016 does not, in fact, have a clear meaning. It is lost in contention and confusion. Neither does England, that idea of England, have any kind of real clarity either. It emerges, as we've seen so spectacularly last night, as a divided thing, bitterly split not just between Leavers and Remainers, but between the England of the big multicultural cities on the one side and the England of the villages and towns on the other. Perhaps this is always so with national revolutions. They are premised on a sacred unity of the people, but have a habit, as in Ireland of course, of morphing into civil wars. Brexit must thus find a way to exit its own messy historical condition into mythological time. This escape from history can be achieved by three particular mental maneuvers. So there's three particular ways in which they've tried to deny the reality that actually England is a very complex place, and that its relationships with the rest of the islands, with the European Union, with its own history, is full of ambiguity. The simplicity that's required for Brexit as a national revolution has to be, as it were, enforced through three different maneuvers that they try. So the first of these maneuvers is one that revolutions often use, which is year zero. We're starting afresh right now. This is the beginning. Brexit, with the horrific exception of the murder of the Labour Member of Parliament Joe Cox, is a bloodless revolution. And in this, it could claim to be characteristic in some ways of English and British history, certainly recent history. It could in principle be imagined as the fourth in a series of bloodless revolutions: the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the replacement of the Stuarts by William of Orange in the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, catastrophically violent in Ireland, of course, but largely peaceful in England itself, and the creation of the welfare state after 1945, which in many ways achieves a kind of redistribution of power and privilege that we tend only to see with violent revolutions. Of course, there was violence in its background, which was the violence of the Second World War, which kind of fed into it, but in itself it is a bloodless revolution. Now, these first three bloodless revolutions each had a different distinctive character. They're respectively a restoration of a previous regime, which was the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the replacement of a governing elite in 1688, and the redistribution from the elites to the masses in 1945. So, which of these does Brexit most resemble? All of them and none of them. And this is maybe why it's so incoherent. It wants to be a restoration. So part of its claim is, take back control. We're going back. We are restoring something which has been lost. There's the idea of restoring Britain as a great power and of an England as it used to be, implied, of course, overwhelmingly white, with fewer foreigners. But of course, neither of those things is really possible. Britain is not going to be restored as a great world power, and England is never going to become the white country that it used to be. It is a kind of elite transfer of power, if we think about the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but what a negligible one. Replacing a Catholic monarchy with a Protestant monarchy in the 17th century was a very big deal. Right? It was a really kind of fundamental shift in the nature of the elite. Replacing David Cameron with his own Home Secretary, who, like him, after all, had voted Remain, doesn't have those epic reverberations, to put it very mildly. Brexit has rhetorically hinted at being a recommitment to the welfare state. So the third of the bloodless revolutions, the welfare state one, it seems to sort of want in some way to connect itself to that. The famous claim of the 350 million a week for the NHS, mendacious as it was very effective because it spoke to something. And of course, if you remember, it's hard to remember now, but Theresa May, her first speech on taking power, standing outside Downing Street, she talked about burning injustices, not burning injustices of the European Union, but burning injustices internally within Britain, which it was her mission to try to resolve. But the 350 million was a lie, of course, and there was no chance that May was going to be the new Clement Attlee. So the historical models of peaceful transformation that the British are working off just don't actually function. The only recourse then was to a great as-if, to behave, and this is real irony, to behave as if the bloodless revolution of Brexit had actually been bloody. This meant, in a delicious irony, imagining the English Revolution as if it were the French Revolution. So, a month before the referendum, Nigel Farage told the BBC that it's legitimate to say that if people feel that they have lost control completely, and we have lost control, then violence is the next step. And of course, this remains a threat that's kind of bubbling up again. If we don't get our Brexit, just you watch. But the problem is that the European Union, whatever you think its faults might be, it's not the ancien regime. The fundamental problem of Brexit is that it is a response to imaginary oppression. So, in order to create the energy for Brexit, you have to imagine yourself as being intolerably oppressed. You have to imagine that the European Union is, the French aristocrats, and that the English people are the sort of long-suffering peasants. Or you have to imagine, and I deal with this in the book, but I won't really go into it too much now, but you have to imagine somehow that Britain lost the Second World War and that the Germans really won it, that they tricked us into something. There's lots of writing, lots of movies, lots of thrillers about reimagining the Second World War as we lost, we surrendered, and the Germans really took over. So that's kind of one part of this self-pity. But in this idea, you have a big problem, right? So the next step in the overthrow of imaginary oppression has to be imaginary violence. It's a kind of costume drama in which Theresa May's government pretended to be the Committee of Public Safety, guardians of the people's will against traitors and fifth columnists. Normally what happens in a revolution is the person that leads the revolution takes power. Because of the sort of camp, performative, game-playing nature of Brexit, it's much more like the sort of medieval carnival where people sweep up the village idiot and make him king for a day, or a week maybe. And the king, he didn't even manage a week, was Boris Johnson. But Johnson was so incompetent, even though he'd just won the largest democratic vote in the history of Britain, he couldn't take power. And so this left this enormous problem. In revolutionary terms, you have a difficulty. To take power in the place of the actual leader of the revolution, Johnson, May had to embrace a literal but entirely phony populism in which the narrow and ambiguous majority who voted for Brexit must be reimagined as the people. This is not English conservatism. It is pure Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The people express the general will freely in a majority vote, and after that, dissent is treason. Within a few months of the vote, on a radio phone-in, Farage was cheerfully trashing the only real principle of the British Constitution, arguing sovereignty does not lie with Parliament, sovereignty lies with the people. So you get sort of Brexit posing as a restoration of power to Parliament, but then because of this sort of phony French revolutionary shtick, it has to imagine the people in this sort of French revolutionary way, and therefore has to imagine everybody who doesn't like it as traitorous. The general will had been established on that sacred referendum day, and it must not be defied or questioned. So hence May's allies in the popular press, particularly the Express and the Mail, at least particularly the Mail under Paul Dacre, who subsequently stepped down, used the language of the French Revolutionary Terror. Recalcitrant parliamentarians were heretics. Judges who ruled on the procedure by which Brexit could be effected were enemies of the people. I'm sure you remember those headlines. The accompanying article to that infamous headline quoted Farage's dark warning that I now fear that every attempt will be made to block or delay the triggering of Article 50. If this is so, they have no idea of the public anger they will provoke. Given his earlier warning of violence, the meaning was clear, as Farage boasted to a cheering audience at Southampton's Concord Club. He would personally, and I quote, don khaki, pick up a rifle and head for the front lines. One wonders which hand he might have carried the rifle in, given that he would have had a pint of beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other. But so it's aux armes, citoyen, with a pint of IPA in one hand and an Armalite in the other, perhaps. But the next logical step then, and this was voiced by Frederick Forsyth, the very successful thriller writer who's also a kind of influential far-right columnist, was to call for loyalty tests for public servants. Those pro-EU fanatics now seeking to frustrate the clear public will are almost entirely on the public payroll. They should be subject to a huge clear-out. To know that every penny entering your bank account comes from the Brexit taxpayer is a privilege. It is to be repaid with loyalty. Forsyth later went the whole hog in another column and labelled any public servant with any scepticism about Brexit as a traitorous fifth column. When Thomas Mayer, the far-right fanatic who murdered Joe Cox during the referendum campaign, told his trial that his name was death to traitors, freedom to Britain, he was at the extreme end of a spectrum that stretched into the respectable mainstream opinion. Much of the rhetoric of Brexit springs from a long reactionary history of imagining an invaded Britain, which I sort of go into in the book. But it's like we're under wartime conditions, and anybody who is not with us is a traitor and a fifth columnist and an enemy of the people. Now, this is really important to understand May's fatal decision to call an election in 2017. It's up to say, well, why the hell did she call an election in 2017? She had a very good working majority, and there was a lot on Britain's plate. She had started the Brexit process. But it was often kind of written off at the time as pure vanity that she wanted her own majority, but actually there's a deeper logic to it. It's the inevitable result of the rhetoric that she had adopted when in her first flush as leader she told her party conference that if you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere, evoking the far-right trope of rootless cosmopolitans who did not deserve citizenship. A working majority is just not enough when such ideas are in the air. In a revolutionary war, a united people must have a unified parliament and a single uncontested leader. One people, one parliament, one ring to rule them all. So the election in 2017 was to ensure that the opposition would be reduced to a token smattering of old socialist cranks and self-evidently traitorous Scots. Crush the saboteurs, screamed the Daily Mail's front page when the surprise poll was announced. Britain would become, in effect, a one-party state. And overawed Europe would bow before this display of British staunchness and concede a Brexit in which, of course, cake supplies would be infinitely renewed. Now, May was actually rather woefully miscast as the Madame Defarge of the Brexit Revolution, the embodiment of the popular will sending saboteurs to the guillotine. But her wavering embodied deeper contradictions. The idea of a single British people united by the Brexit vote was self-evidently ludicrous. Not only do Scotland, Northern Ireland and London have large anti-Brexit majorities, but many of those who did vote for Brexit were deeply unhappy with the social effects of the Conservative austerity policies. So this year zero French revolutionary way of trying to escape history just didn't work. The Committee of Public Safety phase of the Brexit revolution finished less than a year after the referendum, ending when the Tories squandered that majority in June 2017. The attempt to evoke the people as a single entity and to mobilize it against traitors had simply failed. So then we had to move on to the second strategy. Once the French revolutionary fantasies were done with, the next escape hatch from history was heroic failure. The grand cock-up is not new, and in English historical memory, it's not shameful. It's striking if you ever go up the Mall, you know, that great processional way up to Buckingham Palace, and just on the right-hand side, there's a kind of large area off it for statues and memorials. And Stephanie Barchevsky, the historian, pointed out that every single one of the memorials is from a disaster. It's Scott of the Antarctic. It's the Charge of the Light Brigade. It's there is Florence Nightingale, but who was associated with the Crimean War, which was a disaster. I think there's Gordon of Khartoum, you know. So you have in the English, and it is particularly the English imagination, you could say it was powerful enough to affect us. I mean, we have our own triumph of failure, you know, we've done that stuff too. But it's particularly powerful, I think, in Britain for very particular reasons. So the cult of heroic failure, and remember, this is not, might seem abstract, but just go back to the Tory party conference in the autumn, the number of references to Dunkirk, for example, you know, again and again and again. Winston Churchill at the time of Dunkirk said, you don't win wars by retreats. You know, he was actually quite shocked by the fact that people were kind of embracing it as a great victory, you know. But he was perhaps misunderestimating, that's George W. Bush, perhaps underestimating the sheer power of the myth of heroic failure. The cult of heroic failure was in many ways the ultimate colonial appropriation. Britain took to itself not just the resources of its conquered peoples, but their suffering and endurance. The whole power of heroic failure, people think, it was about the British celebrating failure, but it was about celebrating your own suffering and endurance as a way of saying, we're not really imposing ourselves on the rest of the world as ruthless exploiters. We are heroically going out to try to bring civilization to the wildernesses. And we suffer too. We suffer much more than you do. You know, you think this hurts you, it hurts us much more. Just look at poor Gordon of Khartoum, just look at poor Scott of the Antarctic, you know. So it's a kind of self-serving myth of empire, which you can afford when you are running 25% of the world. So only by virtue of actually being in charge can you celebrate the failure. So heroic failure becomes a kind of displaced mythology. The point of the myth of heroic failure is that it's supposed to be a myth. The problem is that it becomes increasingly a reality with Brexit. So in reality, Britain went from being an imperial power to being a reasonably ordinary but still privileged Western European country. But in the apparition that's conjured by Brexit, England in particular dreams itself into the colony status it once so triumphantly imposed on others. So in order to start thinking of yourself as needing to be liberated, you have to first think of yourself as a conquered people, as having been colonized. And of course this comes from, in a way, something really quite simple. In the imperial mentality, there are only two possible states. You are either the top dog or you're being kicked in the head. You're either, to use that great work of literature, which I draw on a lot in the book, 50 Shades of Grey, you're either the dominant or you're the submissive. You know, and this is really at the heart of a lot of the problem, really, which is that Britain cannot think of itself as normal. It can't think of itself as just being an equal partner in a multilateral set of institutions, where you have the same power as everybody else, the same respect, the same dignity as everybody else, the same mutuality going on. Mentally, you're always looking out for, if we're not dominating them, then they must be dominating us. If we're not in charge, then they secretly must be in charge. This kind of paranoid self-pity sets in. So in the apparition conjured by Brexit, the history of the last 45, now 46 years of EU membership is not so much to be awoken from as to be transformed into a masochistic fantasy of an oppression that must be thrown off. The moment of greatest triumph, the defeat of the Nazis, as I said, is reimagined as the moment of greatest humiliation, defeat by a resurgent Germany that has achieved its Reich by stealth rather than by force. Now, if you thrill yourself with these dark imaginings, and they are quite erotic really, you might end up spying salvation in the insights they offer. The EU is a front for a German cabal. That's the paranoid fantasy. And in this second phase of kind of escaping from history, this is a good thing. This suddenly becomes a good thing. Why? Because if the EU, as we all really know, is really a German front, then Brexit's going to be very easy because you just have to deal with the Germans. Brussels doesn't exist. The European Union institutions don't exist. The whole sense of this very complex, rule-bound organization doesn't exist. This will be a deal done between London and Brussels. London and Berlin, rather. David Davis said during the referendum that, and I quote, "The first calling point of the UK's negotiator in the time immediately after Brexit will not be Brussels. It will be Berlin to strike the deal. Absolute access for German cars and industrial goods in exchange for a sensible deal on everything else." Now, this, you might say, is just an idiot. However, this guy becomes Brexit secretary. Right? This is the guy in charge of the negotiations. And a year later, after the referendum, while he is Brexit secretary, Davis appears on the Andrew Marr programme. And Andrew Marr kind of reminds him of this. He says, "You basically argued that the German car industry and German industry generally would put pressure on the German Chancellor, who would put pressure on the EU to ensure that we got a good deal. Is that still your view?" "Oh," replied Davis, "that's where it will end up, yeah." Now, as it became plain that it wasn't going to end up there, that the European Union actually isn't just a German front, and that actually does take seriously the idea of being a rule-bound organisation, which you couldn't just sort of do the deal, quietly over some sausages and beer in Angela Merkel's office. Obviously, David Davis and Boris Johnson, these other people, simply walked away from the field, huffing at May's Chequer plan that proposed accepting a measure of EU influence as the price of certain trading privileges. In November, of course, then came the further outrage of the failure of the EU to accept even that plan wholesale, the Chequers plan, and then there were more resignations. But between the two waves of walkouts, the Brexiteer MP Daniel Hannan had written on Twitter, "No British government could go further to accommodate the EU. If Brussels holds out for more, dictating terms as if to a defeated enemy, a breakdown is inevitable." And I think that phrase is really very telling, dictating terms as if to a defeated enemy. We lost the war. And this morning in the European Parliament, Nigel Farage used exactly the same phrase, that Brussels has been dictating terms as if to a defeated enemy. So this German fantasy, again, it was sort of started off as a fantasy that this is what would save Brexit. We just do the deal with the Germans and then it will all be fine. And then when it goes sour, it's those Nazi bastards are dictating terms to us as if we'd lost the war again. So it hovers between this kind of fantasy of this is the way of escaping the problems of Brexit to this is exactly why we're stuck with this. They're punishing us for beating them. Now, this idea that Hannan aired there of a defeated Britain having to rise again in a national rebirth dovetails with the third and strangest mental manoeuvre to escape history, which is the idea of Britain as Ireland. this one is, you're going to think you're on LSD with some of this, but anyway. Hannon, who's a very kind of influential figure, in all of this, he's kind of one of the people who's kind of driven this for a long time. He's a genuine zealot, right? So we must give him some credit. He's not like Boris Johnson, who just, just says whatever is good for Boris Johnson. Hannon is a true believer. But Hannon, when the Chequers proposals came out, Hannon actually directly compared them to the approach of the pro-treaty side in the early years of Irish independence. And I quote, "When the Irish Free State left the UK in 1921, there were all sorts of conditions about treaty ports and oaths of supremacy and residual fiscal payments. And what very quickly became apparent was not just that those things were unenforceable once the split had been realised, it was that everyone in Britain kind of lost interest in enforcing them. And that there were some difficulties along the way in the 1920s, although there were some difficulties along the way in the 1920s, it turned out to have been better to have grabbed what looked like an imperfect independence and then build on it rather than risking the entire process." And here's where you have to hold on to your brains. In this vertiginous analogy, interwar Britain, Britain of the 1920s and 30s, is today's EU, and Ireland then is Britain now. What Britain was in the 1920s and 30s to the Free State, that's the European Union now, and Britain has replaced Ireland. So the idea, of course, is that we can do the same thing that Ireland did. You can sign up to a treaty, you can take out all sorts of obligations, and then you can kind of slip out of them, and people will forget. It'll be fine. But this is very powerful. This may seem mad, and it is mad, but it's a very powerful idea. And Michael Gove, for example, who's playing a very interesting game in all of this, has been hinting at this again recently. Look, just sign up to the deal. It doesn't matter. Get the withdrawal thing done. I'm sure a couple of years' time we can just tear it all up again. Just look at De Valera. But isn't it? Did we ever think we would get to the point where the British would be taking Ireland's independence from Britain as the model for the way in which they wish to shape their future, and taking Eamon de Valera really as their gold standard of political operation? So the British are now the people against whom they themselves once unleashed Oliver Cromwell and the Black and Tans. They're the gallant natives of a conquered territory rising up against their imperial overlords. Now, for those of us who are Irish, it is tempting to take this as a compliment, but it has one flaw. Britain was not colonised by the European Union. By no stretch of the imagination, and the elasticity of the Brexit imagination is quite astonishing, can the relationship between Brussels and London be credibly compared to that between London and Dublin before the Free State, let alone that between London and colonial Delhi or Nairobi? 46 years of modern history in which the UK has been deeply and profitably intertwined with the EU are here being evaded. But so too, at the same time, is the actual living history of that part of the United Kingdom known as Northern Ireland. As we know, the latest Future of England survey reveals that a breathtaking 83% of Leave voters agree with the proposition that the unravelling of the peace process in Northern Ireland is a price worth paying for a Brexit that allows them to take back control. This is surely not mere cruelty, it's a determination to escape the history of the Irish border as a creation of the British Parliament, of the tolerance by that Parliament of structural discrimination against Northern Irish Catholics, of the awfulness of the Troubles themselves, and most strangely, of the greatest modern British diplomatic success, the Belfast Agreement. So, forget the endless bickering over the technicalities of the Irish backstop. These are the real briars on which Brexit's coat is snagged. For here we come with Ireland and the backstop to a very different way of escaping the nightmare of history. The one that's been unfolding in Ireland over the last 25 years. History on our island really did seem nightmarish. We weren't dreaming it. We seem to be stuck with incompatible notions of national identity, and indeed the sour dregs of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And yet, as we remember, in this very city in 2011, for the first time in a century, it was possible for the British head of state to visit Britain's closest neighbour. And there were no more than 200 people out on the streets of Dublin, probably less on the streets of Cork, protesting about this. It was over. The nightmare really did seem to be over. Anglo-Irish relations were the best they had ever been, which is to say they were utterly normal. They had ceased to be epic and had become ordinary. We in Ireland, by and large, have radically revised our nationalism. Big things changed. The power of the Catholic Church, tainted by the child sex abuse allegations, collapsed in the 1990s. The Irish economy, for good and ill, became a poster child for globalisation. And the search for peace in Northern Ireland forced a rethinking of ideas about identity, sovereignty and nationality. The questions that had tormented Ireland for centuries and fuelled the stubborn troubles that had burned in the north since 1968. Resolving that seemingly interminable conflict could not be done without being radical. Things that nation states do not like, ambiguity, contingency, multiplicity, would have to be lived with, even embraced. Irish people, for the most part, have come to terms with this necessity. The English, as the Brexit referendum suggested, have not. This is why the Irish border has such profound implications for Brexit. It's a physical token of a mental frontier that divides not just territories, but ideas about national identity. It is striking, of course, that it was the Conservative Party, even under Margaret Thatcher, that allowed the seeds of the peace process to be sown in the 1990 announcement by Peter Brook, that careful phrase, the British government has no selfish, strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. And this phrase, since embedded in international law to the Belfast Agreement, is remarkable. Sovereign governments do not ordinarily declare themselves neutral on the question of whether a part of their own state should ultimately cease to be so. But even more remarkable, I think, was the parallel shift in the Irish position. Since Ireland became independent in 1922, Dublin had always looked on Northern Ireland as a part of its national territory, unjustly and temporarily amputated by partition. Now, of course, the Republic too withdrew its territorial claim. I often wonder whether the referendum in 1998 was so overwhelmingly passed because we didn't really read what we were voting for. Just how radical it was, just how radical the change in the definition of national aspiration was in the Constitution. So we deleted, of course, all reference to the idea of the reintegration of the national territory, and we put in something that talks about people. The new articles in our Constitution talk about the stated desire in harmony and friendship to unite all the people who share the territory of the island of Ireland in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. These plurals resonate. Irish nationalism rests itself now on notions of shared space and of multiple identities. Within this shared space, Irish nationalism and Irish identity are understood in radically new ways. The Belfast Agreement recognises, of course, the birthright of all the people of Northern Ireland to identify themselves and be accepted as Irish or British or both as they may so choose. It accepts, in other words, that national identity and the citizenship that flows from it is a matter of choice. Even more profoundly, it accepts that this choice is not binary. Those lovely little words, or both, which I think would be nice to put on our flag in the middle and the white bit, stand as a rebuke to all absolute and absolutist nationalisms. Identities in the way we've had to reformulate our sense of identity are fluid, contingent, and multiple. This is how you awake from the nightmare of history into an embrace of the complex and fluid identities that real people have. When these ideas were framed and entrenched by the referendums on both sides of the border, there was an assumption, of course, that there would always be a third and shared European identity. In the preamble to the Belfast Agreement, the British and Irish governments evoked the close cooperation as partners in the European Union that they had shared. The two countries joined the then EEC in 1973, and particularly after the creation of the single market in 1993, with the free movement of goods, services, capital and labour, the Irish border, as we know, became less of an irritant and more something that we kind of noticed by its absence. While all of this was being done, nobody was thinking about the emergence of another force, English nationalism. There were, as framed in the Belfast Agreement, just two nationalisms on these islands, Irish and British, and they had been reconciled in a creative and civilised way. But the UK contained in every sense other national identities, Scottish, Welsh and English. In Scotland especially, a sense of difference was evident in the devolved Parliament and growing demands for independence. But few of us foresaw, and I very much include myself in this, that the decisive nationalist revolution on these islands would not occur on our part of the Irish Sea. It would not even occur in Scotland. It would be the English nationalist revolution. Brexit is unmistakably a nationalist revolt, albeit one that is contradictory, incoherent, and not fully articulated. It is England's insurrection against the very ideas that animated the Belfast Agreement, the belief that contemporary nationality must be fluid, open, and many-layered. It is so unsure of itself that it escapes from a nightmare into a strange and woozy dream time. So finally, to come back to Ulysses, Mr. Deasy, the boring headmaster, insists, as all utopians do, that all history moves towards one great goal, which for him is the manifestation of God, as he says. In response, and I quote, Stephen jerked his thumb towards the window saying, "That is God." And then we hear the noises, "Hooray, aye, way." "What?" Mr. Deasy asked. "A shout in the street," Stephen answered, shrugging his shoulders. History doesn't move towards a single goal, but it's not a shout in the street either. It's not a moment of national destiny, and it is not a sacred expression of the people's will. It's an endless search for ways in which people, in all the diversity of their traditions, can share space. Perhaps, ultimately, in that light, the Irish border and the problems it has created for Brexit might be thought of not so much as a problem to be overcome for the English, but as a frontier over which we all might have to pass from a mythological history into an acceptance of the complex here and now that is the only place and moment from which we can move forward. Perhaps, to adapt that great Anglo-Irish thinker, Johnny Rotten, Ireland might be the place in which there is, after all, a future in England's dreaming. Thank you.